Good evening, and welcome back. Curl in close to the fire and drift with me tonight to a second-floor apartment in North Harris County, Texas. To the spring of 1998. To a jealous ex-boyfriend pacing in the dark outside his former lover's door. And to a story that doesn't end when the bullets stop flying, but keeps going years later, all the way to a county jail, where that same man slips off his cuffs, changes his clothes, waves a fake badge, and walks straight out the front door of custody. This is the story of Charles Victor Thompson, the man condemned for killing his ex-girlfriend, Glenda Dennise Hayslip, and her new boyfriend, Darren Cain, who would later stun Texas by escaping from the Harris County Jail, and who now sits under an execution date, January the 28th, 2026, at the Huntsville unit. So snuggle up, Buttercup, and waltz with me through the wreckage of a relationship, the night it turned into a double murder, and the time death row's grip loosened just long enough for one condemned man to vanish into the night. By the summer of 1997, 27-year-old Glenda Hayslip, known by Dennise, was trying to build a life that looked, from the outside, pretty ordinary. She lived in a shared house in North Harris County with her young son, her friend Lisa Gonzalez, and Lisa's two daughters. Bills, work, kids, roommates, the everyday juggle. Into that small, crowded world stepped Charles Victor Thompson. Chuck, as he was called, moved in as Denise's boyfriend. At first, he was just another guy trying to find his footing, working off and on, charming enough, with a grin that people later described as all-American. But under the surface, something darker was coiled tight. Jealousy and control began to creep into the relationship. Lisa Gonzalez would later say that when Chuck got angry, it showed up in the house itself. Holes in drywall where fists or boots had landed. A refrigerator kicked in frustration. Things thrown just to make a point. He didn't like being questioned. He didn't like being pushed to work or to contribute to the bills. And above all, he didn't like the idea of Denise's attention wandering anywhere else. One night, Lisa heard shouting in the house. Chuck screaming at Dennise, calling her names, shaking her. When Lisa tried to step in, he grabbed her, threw her to the floor, and ripped the phone cord out of the wall when she tried to call the police. The message was crystal clear. When he lost control, the world around him could be grabbed, shoved, silenced. Eventually, Chuck moved out. Dennise moved on. She found her own apartment, her own space. And sometime in that period, she met a man named Darren Cain. Darren was a bartender at a local bar. He and Dennise started talking, then seeing each other more often. It wasn't some dramatic romance out of a movie. It was two adults meeting at a bar and discovering they liked being in each other's company. For Dennise, it was a chance at something new. For Chuck, it was a threat, because in his mind, the relationship wasn't over. And if there's one thing that keeps showing up in stories like this, it's that some men don't think of women as partners who can leave. They think of them as possessions that shouldn't. Fast forward to the night of April the 29th, 1998. The Houston Rockets are playing. Darren calls his friend, Tony Alfano, and invites him to come to the bar and watch the game. Tony passes. Later that night, actually early the next morning, about 2:30 a.m., Darren calls again. This time, there's something urgent in his voice. He tells Tony that Chuck has called, that he's threatened him over the phone. He says Dennise is being messed with or beaten, and Darren is heading over to her apartment to help. It's one of those small hinge of fate moments. Tony doesn't go. Darren does. Around 3 a.m., one of Dennise's neighbors, Catherine Page, wakes up. Her dog is barking. Outside, she hears shouting. A woman's voice screaming words like stop and help. She steps out, checks the hallway, and sees Dennise and Darren outside the apartment. They look shaken, but not visibly injured. Dennise is apologizing to Darren, saying, "I'm sorry for all of this." Then Chuck comes out. His face is swollen, sporting a black eye, evidence that whatever argument started inside has already turned physical. He's yelling, cussing, calling Dennise a whore. Darren, trying to diffuse things, tells him to chill. Chuck looks right at him and replies with a line that will echo later in court. "Do you want to die, mother effer?" A Harris County deputy, William Coker, arrives in response to the disturbance call. When he pulls up, things seem calmer. He sees 3 people, Darren, Dennise, and Chuck. All are upright. No one is bleeding. No weapons are visible. Chuck's face is bruised, yes, but Coker learns he started the fight. None of them want to press charges. No one wants to escalate. So Coker does the thing officers do in 1,000 small domestic calls. He separates the parties. He tells Chuck to leave the complex. He escorts him off the property and warns him that if he comes back, he'll be trespassing. If you pause the story here, it looks like the crisis has broken. No arrests, no handcuffs, no one in the hospital. But his anger doesn't drain away. It just goes quiet and waits. A few hours pass. The sky over Houston lightens toward grey. People get ready for work and school. Around 6 a.m., Catherine Page's son is heading out for school when he hears gunshots. Moments later, someone starts pounding on their door. When Catherine opens it, she finds Dennise outside, sitting on the ground in a pool of blood, gasping for breath, bleeding from her mouth and cheek. Dennise can't speak clearly, but she can still move her hands. She makes a gesture, like someone firing a gun. For Catherine, it's a horrifying charade. For investigators later, it's the first of several dying declarations. Deputy Coker, the same officer who escorted Chuck off the property a few hours earlier, rushes back to the complex on the new call. He finds Dennise just as Catherine described, seated, bleeding heavily, a bullet hole in her right cheek. He asks her if Charles Thompson shot her. She nods. Yes. Inside the apartment, Coker finds Darren Cain dead. Whatever line Chuck had been standing on hours earlier, he has now stepped far, far past it. Dennise is rushed by life flight to Herman Hospital in Houston, still fighting to breathe. Doctors work to stabilize her. The bullet has gone through her cheek, nearly severing her tongue. It's a devastating injury, one that threatens to drown her in her own blood or choke off her airway. Medical staff try to secure a breathing tube to manage the bleeding, to bring her back from the cliff she's been pushed over. While she waits for surgery, her brother manages to reach her. He asks her a question that cuts straight to the bone. Did Chuck do this? Again, Dennise can't speak. Again, she nods emphatically. Yes. Those nods, the one in the hallway with the deputy, the one in the hospital with her brother, will later become key pieces of evidence. But for her family, there's something else. The last clear, deliberate answers she ever gives. Dennise never comes fully back. Doctors can't secure her airway. She falls into a coma. After heartbreaking days of waiting, her family is told she is brain dead. They make the decision no family wants to make and remove life support. She continues to breathe for a few more days then dies roughly a week after she was shot. The medical examiner ultimately rules her death a homicide caused by the gunshot wound to her face. Darren's story is more brutally simple. He's found dead in the apartment that morning, shot multiple times. So where is Chuck while all of this is unfolding? Not at the hospital, not at the scene. No. He's on a couch at the home of a woman named Diane Zernia. Diane is getting her daughter ready for school when Chuck shows up. He crashes on the couch and falls asleep. After her daughter leaves, Diane flips on the news. There, in the morning broadcast, she sees a story about a shooting at Dennise' apartment. Sometime later, Chuck wakes up. Diane looks at his black eye and, not knowing the full story yet, jokes, "I hope the other guy looks worse." Chuck answers, flat and matter-of-fact, "He does. I shot him." He goes on to describe what happened, according to her later testimony. He says he left the apartments after the earlier fight, got a gun, and came back. He kicked in Dennise' door. He shot Darren 4 times. He turned the gun on Dennise, told her, "I can shoot you too, bitch." Pressed the gun to her cheek and pulled the trigger. He tells Diane he threw the gun into a creek after leaving. Later, the murder weapon will be recovered with help from an informant. A firearms examiner will testify that the gun had to be reloaded during the attack to match the shell casings and wounds. But on that morning, sitting on someone else's couch, Chuck is still moving freely through a world that hasn't fully caught up to what he's done. At some point, he calls his father, who comes to pick him up and drive him. Not out of town, not over the state line, but straight to a police station. There, Charles Thompson turns himself in. Prosecutors charge Chuck with capital murder, killing more than one person during the same criminal episode. In this case, the deaths of Dennise Hayslip and Darren Cain. At trial, the jury hears a story that, by then, has many witnesses. Lisa Gonzalez, describing the escalation of violence in the house, the holes in the walls, the thrown objects, the night he grabbed her and ripped out the phone line when she tried to call for help. Catherine Page, the neighbor, recalling Dennise's apologies in the hallway, the shouted, "Do you want to die, Mother Aoife?" And then, hours later, the gunshots, the pounding on her door, and Dennise bleeding on her doorstep, miming a shooting motion with her hands. Deputy Coker, confirming that he escorted Chuck off the property, then returned to find Dennise gravely wounded and Darren dead inside the apartment. And that when he asked if Chuck shot her, Dennise nodded yes. The doctors, explaining how catastrophic the injury to her face and tongue was, and why it was absolutely capable of causing death, even with medical treatment. Diane Zernia, recounting the chilling confession on her couch, the line, "I shot him," and the detail of Chuck putting the gun to Dennise's cheek and pulling the trigger. The defense, for its part, presses on the medical angle, arguing that negligent hospital care, not the bullet itself, was the true cause of Dennise's death. But both the trial court and later the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals reject that argument. The gunshot, they hold, was still the but-for cause. Without it, there is no coma, no life support, no funeral. In April 1999, a Harris County jury convicts Charles Victor Thompson of capital murder. He is sentenced to death and shipped off to Texas's death row in Livingston, Polunsky unit, where condemned inmates live largely in solitary confinement. For some people, that would be the end of the story. Conviction, sentence, years of appeals. But Chuck Thompson has another chapter in him. One that will make national news. On direct appeal, Chuck's conviction is upheld, but his death sentence is vacated. Not because he was found innocent, not because the jury got the facts wrong, but because of a technical issue. Prosecutors played a recorded jail call at the punishment phase without giving proper notice to the defense. The state's highest criminal court decides that was a Sixth Amendment problem and sends the case back for a new punishment hearing. So in 2005, Chuck is transported from death row back to Houston for a resentencing. The same murders, the same underlying facts, but a brand new jury to decide whether he lives or dies in prison. They hear about the double killing. They hear about his attempts while awaiting trial to arrange hits on a woman who was going to testify against him. They hear from people who say he can be violent, whether he's drunk or sober. And once again, the jury comes back with death. Charles Victor Thompson is, for the second time, a condemned man. He is supposed to be on his way back to Livingston, back to a life measured in legal filings and lockdowns. Instead, he looks at the system's routine and sees something else, a crack. In October 2005, at the Harris County Jail in Houston, Chuck is in an interview room, handcuffed, wearing an orange jumpsuit, waiting to meet with an attorney. But the lawyer who comes that day isn't his usual one. He's another attorney, later described only as a witness in the investigation. When the meeting ends, the lawyer leaves. Chuck doesn't. He's left alone in the room. That's when he moves. Somehow. Chuck removes his handcuffs. Authorities to this day don't like to dwell on those details. Anyway, Chuck strips off the bright orange jail jumpsuit and pulls on street clothes. A dark blue shirt, khaki pants, white tennis shoes. Investigators later say these were the clothes he'd worn during the resentencing, smuggled back to his cell and stashed away until he had a chance to use them. Once dressed, he opens the door and steps out of the inmate booth, not as a prisoner, but as a man trying on a different identity. He has a fake ID badge, something that looks official enough in the blur of a busy jail, the kind of badge you might see hanging from the neck of an investigator or someone from the Attorney General's office. He walks past at least 4 jail employees. He waves the badge when challenged. No one stops him. Incredibly, he's buzzed through into the public lobby. From there, he walks out the doors and into the streets of Houston as if he were finishing his shift, not escaping a death sentence. For the next 70-odd hours, a condemned double murderer is on the loose. When reporters later ask him how it felt, he'll say one word: great. But that great comes at a cost. Jurors and victims' families flee their homes, move into hotels, look over their shoulders wondering if the man they helped condemn will show up at their front door. Chuck doesn't head straight to Mexico or vanish into some elaborate underground network. Instead, he moves in a way that feels oddly small scale. He drifts. In Shreveport, Louisiana, he tells people he's a Hurricane Katrina evacuee to get clothes, food, and a little money. He blends in just enough for strangers to feel sorry for him, to open their wallets and closets. Meanwhile, U.S. Marshals designate him a federal fugitive and put up a $10,000 reward. His mugshot is everywhere. Law enforcement tracks tips, chases down sightings, tries to figure out how a man sentenced to death walked out of their grasp so cleanly. On November 7th, 2005, 4 days after the escape, the run ends. Outside a place called Daiquiri Unlimited in Shreveport, officers spot a man at a payphone who looks a lot like the pictures they've been staring at. They approach him and ask his name. He doesn't try some new lie. He doesn't pretend to be someone else. "You know who I am," he says. Then he confirms it. "I'm Charles Thompson." Guns are drawn, cuffs go back on. The little taste of freedom is over. Back in Texas, officials scramble to explain how this happened and how it won't happen again. But for the families, for Darren's loved ones, for Dennise's brother and relatives, one thought dominates. How the hell did he walk right out of prison? After his capture, Chuck is returned to Texas custody. He ends up back where the state always meant him to be, on death row at Polunsky, in a small concrete cell, 23 hours a day alone, 1 hour in a separate cage for recreation. He starts writing. Letters, reflections, posts that eventually make their way onto prison blogs through people on the outside. Advocates point to his claimed spiritual conversion, his Third Order Franciscan Association, his statements about regret. His lawyers continue to fight his case in the courts, raising familiar issues about the medical causation of Dennise's death, about his background, about whether this is the sort of crime that should merit death over life without parole. Federal courts examine the records, weigh the arguments, and one by one shut the doors. His conviction stands. His resentencing stands. Meanwhile, the story of his escape gets picked up by documentaries. He appears in an episode of Extreme Prison Breaks, and later in the Netflix series I Am a Killer, where audiences get to see the man behind the headlines sitting behind glass, telling his version of events. But for the families of Dennise and Darren, no TV interview or blog post erases a simple, stubborn fact. Their loved ones are still gone. On September 11, 2025, in a Harris County courtroom, a judge signs a piece of paper that moves this story into its final chapter. It's an execution warrant. It orders that on January 28, 2026, the state of Texas will take custody of Charles Victor Thompson from Polunsky Unit, transport him to the Huntsville Unit, and at a scheduled hour, put him to death by lethal injection. In that courtroom, some of Darren Cain's family and friends sit in the gallery as the state lays out the timeline, explaining that most of Chuck's appeals are done, that the case has wound through the courts for over 2 decades, and that it is time, in the state's view, to carry out the sentence. They've waited more than 25 years from the night he told Darren to chill, and then asked if he wanted to die. The warrant doesn't guarantee that the execution will happen. There can still be last-minute appeals, clemency petitions, legal storms forming just over the horizon. But it changes something fundamental. For the first time, the end of the line has a date. On paper, it's just another entry in the death row schedule. Huntsville Unit, January 28, 2026. In reality, it's a quiet earthquake in every life connected to that case. Thanks for listening. This has been Fireside Crime Stories, where the darkest tales are always read by firelight. If you haven't already, subscribe. And before you go, toss a little fuel on the fire. Hit that like button, ring that bell, so you'll be the first to know when another fire's burning and another story's being told. Until next time, rest well.